Something is shifting in the Persian Gulf, and it is happening right now in real time, at a speed that most people are not fully prepared to process. On one side of this standoff, you have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, battle-hardened, ideologically fanatical, and cornered by the most suffocating maritime blockade that any nation has faced in the modern era. On the other side, you have the full weight of American military power, 3 carrier strike groups, over 50,000 personnel, 200 combat aircraft, and a naval cordon so airtight that 41 Iranian tankers carrying 69 million barrels of oil are sitting completely frozen, unable to move, unable to sell, hemorrhaging billions of dollars that the regime desperately needs to survive. But here is what nobody is talking about clearly enough. Something new just entered this equation, something that changes the entire calculus of this confrontation in ways that neither Tehran nor most Western analysts have fully absorbed. The United States Army's Dark Eagle hypersonic weapon system has just had a formal deployment request submitted to the highest levels of the American government. And if that request gets approved, the world is about to witness the first combat use of an American hypersonic missile, a weapon that travels faster than anything Iran can track, faster than anything Iran can intercept, and faster than the Iranian regime can react. The question is not whether this weapon can do the job. The question is whether the men in Tehran understand just how fundamentally the rules of this game have changed. And the uncomfortable answer, based on everything playing out right now, is that they may not. Let that sit for a second. Because what we are watching unfold is not just another chapter in the long, complicated, exhausting story of American confrontation with Iran. This is something categorically different. This is the United States government deploying technology that, until very recently, existed only in classified laboratories and controlled test ranges. This is a weapon system that was designed specifically to strike the kinds of targets that conventional munitions cannot reliably reach. Deeply buried mountain bunkers, reinforced underground missile storage complexes, hardened command facilities that were engineered over decades of Iranian investment to survive everything that has come before. And the fact that U.S. Central Command has formally put the Dark Eagle on the table, that Admiral Brad Cooper is personally briefing the President of the United States on its potential combat applications, tells you everything you need to know about how seriously American military leadership is taking this moment. This is not a bluff. This is not theater. This is a deployment request for a weapon that the United States Army has never once fired in anger. And the target set is Iran's most protected and most strategically critical military infrastructure. So let us break this down completely. From the weapon itself, to the targets it would hit, to what Iran would do in response, to what this entire confrontation means for the next 6 months of geopolitical reality in the Middle East. First, you have to understand what the Dark Eagle actually is, because the name alone does not do justice to the sheer engineering achievement that this system represents. Officially designated the Long Range Hypersonic Weapon, or LRHW, the Dark Eagle is the product of years of classified research, billions of dollars of investment, and a direct American response to the hypersonic missile programs that Russia and China have been aggressively developing throughout the last decade. The United States watched as Moscow unveiled the Avangard and the Kinjal. It watched as Beijing tested the DF-17 and the DF-41 derivatives with hypersonic glide bodies. And the American military establishment made a decision that it would not allow a hypersonic missile gap to develop the way a bomber gap or a missile gap had threatened American strategic superiority in previous eras. The Dark Eagle is the direct product of that decision. It pairs a ground-launched booster rocket with what the military calls a common hypersonic glide body, a maneuverable re-entry vehicle that separates from the booster at high altitude and then descends toward its target at speeds exceeding Mach 5. That is 5 times the speed of sound, or roughly 1 mile per second. At terminal velocity, in its final approach to a target, it is moving so fast that even the most advanced air defense systems currently deployed anywhere in the world have an extraordinarily narrow window to detect, track, and engage it. That window is measured not in minutes, but in seconds. Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman are the primary contractors on this program, and both have brought their most advanced materials, science and guidance technology to the development process. The result is a weapon with a stated operational range exceeding 1,700 miles and the ability to strike fixed or semi-mobile targets with a precision that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. Now here is where it gets strategically devastating for the IRGC specifically. The entire Iranian defensive posture over the last decade has been built around one central assumption that the United States, no matter how powerful, faces significant limitations when it comes to striking hardened, deeply buried, or rapidly relocatable targets. Iranian military engineers spent enormous resources and decades of effort building a network of underground missile storage facilities, fortified command bunkers, and mountain-embedded launch complexes that were specifically designed to survive conventional airstrikes. The thinking in Tehran was rational. If your facilities are buried under hundreds of meters of reinforced concrete and granite mountainside, if your missile launchers can emerge, fire, and retreat in a matter of minutes, then even the most sophisticated conventional air campaign will struggle to systematically destroy your retaliatory capability. And for a long time, that thinking had real strategic merit. But the Dark Eagle is designed precisely to invalidate that assumption. Its hypersonic speed means that a mobile ballistic missile launcher has almost no time to react and retreat after being identified. Its range means it can be fired from platforms outside the immediate theater of conflict, reducing the risk to American assets. And its maneuvering capability at hypersonic speeds means that even if Iranian radar somehow detects the inbound weapon, the trajectory is not predictable enough for existing air defense systems to reliably engage it. Consider the specific facility that intelligence analysts keep returning to when they talk about the Dark Eagle's most likely first targets. Deep in the Zagros mountain range, and at sites like the Persian complex and the missile storage facilities near Yazd, Iran has constructed what can only be described as a subterranean military architecture. These are not simple storage warehouses. These are purpose-built, multi-layered underground facilities with reinforced entrances carved directly into canyon walls, with internal rail systems for moving missile launchers, with independent power generation and ventilation systems designed to keep operations running even during an active air campaign above ground. The entrances are camouflaged, the approaches are monitored, and the facilities are engineered to give Iranian military operators the ability to roll a ballistic missile launcher out into daylight, elevate, fire a salvo at a Gulf state capital or an American forward operating base, and retract back into the mountain before a conventional response strike can even be authorized and launched. That is the tactical problem the Dark Eagle solves. Because when your weapon travels at Mach 5 and your decision to launch cycle is measured in minutes rather than hours, the window between detection and impact collapses in a way that fundamentally alters the risk calculation for every Iranian missile crew currently sitting inside one of those mountain bunkers. But we need to zoom out now, because the Dark Eagle does not exist in isolation. It is one piece of a layered military pressure campaign that the United States has been methodically constructing since this confrontation escalated. The naval blockade is the foundation. 3 carrier strike groups operating in the region, with the combined air wing capacity of approximately 200 fighters and strike aircraft, represent a conventional military presence that Iran simply cannot match in open confrontation. The RQ-4 Global Hawk unmanned reconnaissance platforms are operating in persistent orbits, maintaining continuous surveillance over Iranian port facilities, over the Strait of Hormuz, over the naval approaches that Iran would need to use to break the blockade through force. Marine Expeditionary Unit assets have already demonstrated their willingness to board and redirect commercial vessels, attempting to violate the interdiction zone. 42 ships turned back, 41 tankers frozen in place, 69 million barrels of Iranian oil sitting unsold. The financial damage is not theoretical. At current market prices, the $6 billion revenue loss that Admiral Cooper cited represents a catastrophic blow to a regime that was already operating under severe economic stress from years of accumulated sanctions. The IRGC's funding model depends on oil revenue. Its weapons programs, its proxy network across Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, its internal security apparatus, all of it flows from the same revenue stream that the blockade is systematically strangling. And now, layered on top of that economic pressure, the United States is placing a hypersonic weapon system on the table, one capable of surgically destroying the very military infrastructure that gives the IRGC its leverage and its deterrent credibility. This is a strategic combination that military historians will study for decades. Economic asphyxiation paired with the credible threat of precision hypersonic strikes against hardened military infrastructure. It is not simply about destroying targets. It is about destroying the Iranian regime's confidence that it can absorb punishment and continue functioning. The IRGC's power within Iran is not purely military. It is economic. It is political. It is psychological. The Guard Corps controls vast portions of the Iranian domestic economy. It operates construction companies, telecommunications networks, import-export businesses, and financial institutions that are deeply embedded in the fabric of Iranian civilian life. When the blockade cuts off oil revenue, it does not just hurt the regime's defense budget. It creates cascading economic pain that ripples through every sector of the Iranian economy that the IRGC touches. And when that economic pressure is amplified by the credible threat that the physical infrastructure of Iranian military power, the bunkers, the missile storage facilities, the logistics nodes, the power distribution networks that keep missile production facilities running, could be struck at hypersonic speed with virtually no warning, the psychological dimension becomes just as important as the physical one. Think about what that means for the Iranian leadership right now. They are sitting in hardened facilities, running economic and military operations under a blockade that is generating roughly $6 billion of accumulated financial damage and growing every single day. Their public rhetoric remains defiant. The blockade is doomed to fail. The Strait of Hormuz cannot be controlled indefinitely. A swift and decisive response awaits any further American aggression. But behind that rhetoric, the calculations happening in private are almost certainly far more complicated. Because the IRGC's military planners understand, even if they will not admit it publicly, that the balance of this confrontation has shifted in ways that their defensive architecture was not designed to handle. They built their mountain bunkers to survive F-16s and cruise missiles. They built their dispersal strategy to survive conventional airstrikes. They did not build it to survive a weapon that arrives with virtually no warning at terminal velocities, that their radar systems struggle to track, and that their interceptors cannot reliably engage. Now, to be precise and honest about the situation, the Dark Eagle has not yet been approved for deployment. What exists right now is a formal request from U.S. Central Command that has been submitted for presidential consideration. That distinction matters. The decision to deploy an untested combat system, a weapon that has never been fired in actual warfare, is not one that gets made lightly, regardless of how strong the operational case might be. There are political dimensions to consider. There are alliance management concerns. There are questions about escalation control and about what message the first combat use of an American hypersonic weapon sends to Beijing and Moscow, both of whom have been watching this confrontation very carefully and drawing their own conclusions about American military doctrine and political resolve. But the fact that the request is on the table, that it has been formally submitted through the chain of command and is being briefed to the president, means it has cleared every preliminary military and legal threshold that would be required before such a step is taken. This is not a random idea floated in a think tank. This is a formal operational proposal from the combatant command responsible for the Middle East theater, backed by the professional military judgment of Admiral Brad Cooper and the broader CENTCOM staff. And the $15 million price tag per missile that gets attached to these discussions needs to be understood in the proper strategic context. $15 million sounds like an enormous sum when you say it in isolation. But measure it against the cost of a sustained ballistic missile exchange in the Persian Gulf. Measure it against the economic damage of a fully closed Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply flows on any given day. Measure it against the cost of rebuilding American forward operating bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE if they absorb sustained ballistic missile strikes from the remaining elements of Iran's missile inventory. Suddenly, $15 million per precision hypersonic strike against a hardened missile launch complex looks less like an expense and more like an investment in preventing a catastrophically more expensive escalation scenario. The United States military has always understood this arithmetic, and the decision-makers now weighing the Dark Eagle deployment request understand it too. Let us spend a moment on what Iran's response options actually look like if this conflict reignites and the Dark Eagle goes into action. Because this is where the strategic picture gets genuinely complicated and where Iranian decision-making becomes hardest to predict. The public messaging from Tehran has been consistent. The blockade will fail, the strait will reopen, Gulf neighbor energy infrastructure is at risk, and Iran's response to further aggression will be swift, stern, and decisive. That messaging is designed for multiple audiences simultaneously. It is designed to project strength to the Iranian domestic population, which has been told for years that the IRGC is an invincible resistance force. It is designed to deter American escalation by making the cost calculus seem prohibitively high. And it is designed to signal to regional actors, particularly the Gulf Cooperation Council states, that alignment with American military operations carries tangible risk to their own energy infrastructure and economic stability. But here is the brutal strategic reality underneath that public posture. Iran's ballistic missile inventory, which was already severely degraded by the strikes that preceded this ceasefire period, is not an unlimited resource. Every ballistic missile that Iran fires is one that cannot be replaced quickly, given the blockade's disruption of supply chains for missile components and propellant materials. Every launcher that exposes itself to fire a salvo is one that could be detected and struck during its exposure window. And every attempted saturation attack against Gulf state energy infrastructure or American bases is one that runs directly into the Iron Dome, Patriot batteries, THAAD systems, and Arrow 3 interceptors that have been reinforced and resupplied throughout this confrontation. The Iranian strategic calculus is essentially a race against time and against resource depletion. The regime's calculation appears to be that it can sustain economic and psychological pressure long enough that American domestic politics, European alliance management concerns, or Gulf state wavering will force a negotiated resolution more favorable to Iranian interests. That is a rational theory of the case, grounded in the historical record of how American military pressure campaigns have often eventually stalled or reversed. But that theory depends on the United States and its partners absorbing the cost of a prolonged standoff without escalating to the level of kinetic military action that would systematically dismantle the IRGC's remaining military infrastructure. The Dark Eagle deployment request suggests that American military leadership has concluded that the window for that Iranian theory of the case may be closing, and that the tools are now available to fundamentally change the terms of the confrontation. There is also a dimension to this story that goes well beyond the immediate US-Iran bilateral confrontation, and it connects directly to the global strategic competition that defines the current era of international relations. Russia and China have both invested enormous resources in hypersonic missile development precisely because they concluded, years ago, that hypersonic speed and maneuverability would eventually negate the missile defense investments that the United States and its allies had made over decades. The American deployment of the Dark Eagle, if it occurs and if it succeeds in combat, is not just a message to Tehran. It is a demonstration to Moscow and Beijing that the United States has successfully fielded its own operational hypersonic strike capability, one that has been tested not in a controlled range environment but in actual combat conditions against real hardened targets with real consequences. That demonstration carries strategic significance that extends far beyond the Persian Gulf. It reshapes the global conversation about hypersonic weapons, about missile defense, about the future of conventional deterrence, and about whether any nation's hardened military infrastructure can be considered truly protected in an era of operational hypersonic strike systems. Consider the message that sends to the military planners in Beijing who have spent years constructing hardened underground facilities in Fujian province facing Taiwan. Consider what it means for Russian military planners who have built their own deeply buried command facilities, expecting that their hardened construction would provide meaningful protection from conventional American strikes. The successful combat demonstration of a hypersonic weapon system with Mach 5 plus terminal velocity and maneuverability does not just resolve the Iran problem. It reshapes the fundamental assumptions of strategic deterrence across every theater where American power is in competition with peer adversaries. That is why the decision being made in Washington right now is one of the most strategically consequential choices of the current administration, regardless of how it resolves. Approve the deployment, and you potentially end the Iran standoff on American terms, while simultaneously delivering a global deterrence message of historic significance. Decline the deployment, and you preserve escalation space, but potentially signal to Tehran that its defiant strategy has enough room to continue. The targeting logic for the Dark Eagle in the Iranian context is worth examining in careful detail because it illuminates exactly how this weapon would be integrated into a broader operational campaign rather than used as a standalone silver bullet. The primary target set is the hardened ballistic missile storage and launch complexes. Facilities like those embedded in the canyon walls near Yazd, complexes in the Zagros Mountains, and the broader network of underground launch sites that Iran has constructed specifically to give its missile forces survivability against conventional airstrikes. These facilities have multiple dimensions of military value. They protect the physical missiles from destruction before launch. They provide protected space for maintenance, fueling, and preparation operations. And perhaps most importantly, they provide the psychological foundation for Iran's deterrence posture. The confidence that no matter how severe an American or Israeli airstrike campaign might be, enough survival launch capacity remains to inflict devastating retaliation on the attacker. The Dark Eagle targeting against these complexes is not just about physical destruction. It is about collapsing that psychological foundation, demonstrating that the survivability Iran's military planners thought they had purchased through decades of underground construction is far more fragile than they believed. Secondary target sets would logically include the power generation and distribution infrastructure that supports Iranian military-industrial operations. The Shahed drone program, which has supplied thousands of munitions to Russian forces in Ukraine, and which remains a central element of Iranian asymmetric military capability, requires substantial industrial infrastructure to sustain production at scale. Specialized manufacturing equipment, precision machining tools, electronics assembly lines, propellant production facilities, all of this industrial capacity requires reliable power, and the power generation nodes that serve dual-use military-industrial infrastructure represent legitimate and legally defensible military targets under the laws of armed conflict. Strikes against these nodes would not carry the same immediate visual drama as destroying a ballistic missile launcher, but their strategic effect over weeks and months of sustained disruption would be potentially more damaging to Iran's long-term military capacity. A ballistic missile can be replaced, given time and resources. The precision industrial equipment and specialized manufacturing knowledge that goes into drone production is far harder to reconstitute under blockade conditions. There's also a command and control dimension that military planners are certainly factoring into any Dark Eagle employment concept. The IRGC's operational effectiveness depends on a communications and command architecture that allows senior leadership to direct forces across a wide geographic area, coordinate with proxy forces in multiple countries, and manage crisis escalation in real time. That architecture has physical nodes, facilities, relay stations, fiber optic hubs, satellite ground terminals that are geographically fixed and that represent potentially high-value targets for precision hypersonic strikes. Degrading the IRGC's ability to communicate and coordinate does not just reduce its immediate military effectiveness. It undermines the psychological and political authority that IRGC commanders exercise within the Iranian power structure. An IRGC leadership that cannot reliably communicate, that is operating in an environment where its physical infrastructure is being systematically dismantled, faces internal credibility. Challenges that no amount of public defiance rhetoric can fully paper over. Now, setting aside the purely military analysis for a moment, let us look at the diplomatic and political landscape, because the Dark Eagle story does not unfold in a vacuum. It unfolds in a context where Iranian negotiators are still publicly pushing their two-phase proposal, sanctions relief first, nuclear talks second, and where European governments, particularly Germany, are actively attempting to position themselves as mediators who can facilitate an off-ramp. The Iranian strategy of seeking to peel Germany and other European Union members away from full alignment with American pressure has some historical precedent. European economic interests in Iranian trade and energy markets, combined with genuine concern about regional instability, have historically created tension between European diplomatic instincts and American pressure strategies. But the Gulf Cooperation Council states have, by all available reporting, demonstrated a notably different posture in this confrontation. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain have not only tolerated the American military presence in their territories, but have in various ways actively supported it, recognizing that the IRGC's regional ambitions represent a far more existential threat to their own political stability than any temporary economic disruption from a prolonged American-Iranian confrontation. This regional alignment is strategically significant in ways that go beyond tactical military cooperation. When the Gulf states, which represent the primary potential targets of any Iranian ballistic missile retaliation, actively support rather than resist American military pressure, it removes one of the key leverage points that Iran has historically used to complicate American strategic options. Tehran has consistently tried to use the threat of Gulf state targeting to create pressure on those governments to distance themselves from American military operations. The fact that the opposite appears to be occurring, that Gulf states are doubling down on their alignment with American operations, even in the face of explicit Iranian threats against their energy infrastructure, represents a significant strategic defeat for the Iranian theory of regional influence, and it is a defeat that the IRGC's internal communications are certainly processing, regardless of what the external messaging suggests. The economic dimension of this confrontation deserves sustained attention because it is, in many ways, the most decisive battlefield. The blockade is not simply a military operation, it is a financial weapon of extraordinary precision and power. Every day that 41 tankers sit frozen with 69 million barrels of unsold Iranian oil is a day that the IRGC loses the revenue it needs to pay its contractors, supply its proxy forces, fund its weapons procurement, and maintain the economic patronage networks that sustain its political power within Iran. $6 billion of accumulated losses, with the meter running every single day, represents damage to the Iranian regime's financial position that no diplomatic speech or public defiance posture can offset. And the compounding nature of that damage matters enormously. Revenue that is not collected today cannot be reinvested in military programs, cannot be used to purchase missile components or drone parts or weapons propellant on the black market, cannot be channeled to Hezbollah or the Houthis or the various Iraqi militia groups that depend on IRGC funding for their operational capacity. The blockade is not just hurting Iran today. It is degrading Iran's military and political capacity for years into the future. This is why the combination of economic blockade and hypersonic strike capability is so strategically potent. The blockade attacks the financial foundation of IRGC power. The Dark Eagle threatens the physical infrastructure of IRGC military capability. Together, they create a pressure dynamic that operates on two entirely different timescales simultaneously. The financial damage accumulates daily and inexorably, creating a slow-burning crisis that the regime cannot simply wait out. The hypersonic threat operates on a completely different timescale, instantaneous, unpredictable, capable of changing the strategic situation in the span of a single minute. When you are a military commander inside an IRGC mountain bunker, you are now facing pressure that operates both on a strategic level over weeks and months, and on a tactical level, where your entire operational calculus can be invalidated within 60 seconds of a weapon being launched from hundreds of miles away. That psychological combination is genuinely unprecedented in the history of American confrontations with Iran. Let us also be honest about the uncertainties, because good strategic analysis requires acknowledging what we do not know. The Dark Eagle, for all its impressive specifications, has not been fired in combat. Test range performance and real-world combat performance are not always identical. The weapon has faced developmental delays. Those delays were not manufacturing accidents. They reflected genuine engineering challenges in integrating the guidance systems, the thermal protection materials, and the propulsion technology at the required performance specifications. Those challenges were ultimately resolved, at least to the satisfaction of the military program managers who certified the system for operational deployment. But the first combat use of any new weapon system invariably reveals operational realities that laboratory and range testing cannot fully replicate. The Iranian target environment is complex. Mountain terrain creates radar and targeting challenges. Underground facilities require the weapon to strike at precise angles and with precise timing to maximize penetration and effect. And the operational coordination required to integrate Dark Eagle strikes with concurrent air operations by F-35s and F-15Es and electronic warfare assets requires a level of joint force coordination that is practiced in exercises but has never been executed in actual combat conditions. None of these uncertainties invalidate the strategic case for deployment if the decision is made to resume kinetic operations. They simply underscore that the first combat use of the Dark Eagle will be watched with extraordinary intensity by American military planners, by Allied defense establishments, and by adversary military institutions, who will be seeking to understand the weapon's actual combat performance parameters. Every piece of observable data from a Dark Eagle combat strike, the approach trajectory, the impact point accuracy, the penetration depth against hardened targets, the terminal velocity, will be analyzed in exhaustive detail by Russian and Chinese defense intelligence. In a sense, the first combat use of the Dark Eagle is also a strategic intelligence event of global significance, one that will shape hypersonic weapon development programs and defensive countermeasure research in every major military establishment on Earth for years to come. The F-35 and F-15E integration piece is worth expanding on, because the Dark Eagle's real operational value is not as a standalone system, but as the opening act in a layered strike package that is designed to systematically overwhelm every layer of Iranian air defense simultaneously. The Dark Eagle's role is essentially to kick the door down, to strike the hardened targets that would otherwise require multiple conventional strike sorties with penetrating munitions, doing it faster and with less warning than any conventional system could provide. Once those hardened targets are struck, the F-35 Lightning II, II's stealthy approach capability and its sophisticated electronic warfare suite allow it to penetrate the degraded Iranian air defense environment and prosecute suppression of enemy air defense missions against whatever radar and surface-to-air missile systems remain operational. The F-15E Strike Eagle, operating with its massive payload capacity and its ability to carry the full range of precision-guided munitions in the American inventory, then follows to deliver the conventional follow-on strikes that complete the systematic destruction of target sets. This is not improvised. This is a carefully choreographed multi-domain strike package that has been rehearsed and refined over years of exercises, and it is designed to present Iranian air defenses with simultaneous threats from multiple vectors that no existing Iranian integrated air defense system is capable of handling all at once. The three carrier strike groups currently operating in the region need to be understood in this context not just as a symbolic show of force, but as an operational capability of genuine and decisive scale. A single American carrier strike group represents, in its air wing alone, a combat aviation force larger than the entire air forces of most medium-sized nations. Three carrier strike groups operating in coordination with land-based air assets in the Gulf, with the Dark Eagle's ground-launched hypersonic capability, and with the submarine-launched cruise missile capacity that the U.S. Navy routinely deploys in forward positions during major confrontations. This is a combined arms force of a scale and sophistication that simply has no parallel in Iranian military planning. The IRGC has studied American military doctrine carefully for decades. Its commanders are not naive about the scale of military power arrayed against them, and yet the rhetoric of defiance continues, which brings us to one of the most analytically challenging questions in this entire situation. Are the Iranian hardliners genuinely miscalculating the strategic situation, or are they executing a rational strategy of maximum resistance designed to extract the best possible diplomatic terms before an inevitable accommodation? The answer, almost certainly, is that there is genuine diversity of strategic calculation within the Iranian system. The IRGC hardliners who control the military apparatus have institutional and ideological incentives to resist accommodation, because accommodation fundamentally undermines the IRGC's political position within Iran and its claim to represent an invincible resistance movement. For IRGC commanders, the credibility of the resistance narrative is not just a matter of external propaganda, it is the foundational justification for the institutional power, economic privilege, and political authority that the IRGC has accumulated within the Iranian state over decades. An IRGC that negotiates from weakness, that accepts terms under military and economic pressure, is an IRGC whose domestic political position is fundamentally damaged. That creates structural incentives for maximalist resistance that are somewhat independent of the actual strategic situation on the ground. But other elements of the Iranian system, diplomatic figures, pragmatic technocrats, elements of the traditional military establishment that views the IRGC's adventurism as a threat to Iranian national interests, may be calculating the situation more clearly and pushing for an accommodation that limits the damage before it becomes truly catastrophic. This internal Iranian tension is, in some ways, the most important variable in the entire confrontation. The United States and its partners cannot resolve this Iranian internal debate through external pressure alone. But they can create conditions in which the costs of continued IRGC intransigence become so clear and so immediate that the internal Iranian political balance shifts in favor of accommodation. That is, at its core, what the combination of the naval blockade, the Dark Eagle deployment request, and the sustained conventional military presence in the region is designed to accomplish. Not to destroy Iran, not to force regime change through military means, but to make the costs of continued confrontation so unambiguous and so escalating that the internal political balance in Tehran tilts toward groups willing to engage in serious negotiations on terms that reflect the actual military and economic reality of the situation, rather than the public defiance narrative that IRGC hardliners prefer. The coming days will be extraordinarily revealing. The presidential decision on the Dark Eagle deployment request will tell us something important about American strategic intent. Whether Washington is positioning for a negotiated resolution in the near term or preparing for a resumption of kinetic operations if no diplomatic progress materializes within the current ceasefire window. Iranian behavior in the coming days will be equally revelatory. If Tehran makes any movement toward substantive engagement on the nuclear and sanctions issues, not the public positioning and procedural demands that have characterized Iranian diplomacy for decades, but actual engagement on the core issues, it will suggest that the blockade and the hypersonic threat are genuinely shifting the internal Iranian calculation. If the defiance rhetoric intensifies and Iranian proxies begin probing American forces or Gulf state infrastructure, it will suggest that the IRGC hardliners have retained sufficient internal control to push back against any accommodationist impulse. What is not in doubt is that the Dark Eagle's appearance in this confrontation represents something historically significant, regardless of how the immediate political situation resolves. For the first time in the modern era, the United States military has formally proposed the combat use of a hypersonic weapon system in an actual operational theater against a real adversary's military infrastructure. That proposal reflects years of investment in a technology that American military strategists concluded was necessary to maintain decisive strategic advantage in an era when peer competitors were aggressively pursuing the same capability. It reflects a judgment by the professional military leadership at Central Command that the Iranian target environment, with its hardened bunkers and its mobile ballistic missile architecture, represents precisely the use case for which the Dark Eagle was developed. And it reflects a broader American strategic posture that is willing, in this confrontation, to absorb the escalatory risks of deploying revolutionary military technology in order to reshape the terms of the standoff decisively, rather than allowing it to grind on indefinitely at enormous cost to American allies in the region and to global energy markets. The ceasefire is holding. For now. But holding a ceasefire and resolving the underlying confrontation are two entirely different things, and nothing about the current situation suggests that the underlying confrontation is anywhere close to resolution. The IRGC is not going to abandon its ballistic missile program, its nuclear ambitions, or its regional proxy network because of public pressure or polite diplomatic entreaties. It may, however, make strategic accommodations if the combination of economic strangulation through the blockade and credible hypersonic military threat to its irreplaceable military infrastructure convinces enough of the Iranian decision-making apparatus that the current path leads to a genuinely catastrophic outcome. That is the theory behind the pressure campaign. It is a rational theory, and the Dark Eagle's presence in this equation may be the element that finally makes the mathematics undeniable even to the most committed IRGC hardliner. Because ultimately, this is what American strategic power looks like when it is fully mobilized and methodically applied. Economic pressure that accumulates daily and inexorably, denying the regime the financial oxygen it needs to sustain its military and political apparatus. Conventional military presence of overwhelming scale that makes any Iranian conventional military response a losing proposition from the first engagement. And now, a hypersonic strike capability that eliminates the last refuge of Iranian strategic optimism. The belief that hardened underground infrastructure provides meaningful survivability against American military power. 3 carrier strike groups, 200 combat aircraft, 50,000 personnel, a naval blockade enforcing itself on 42 attempted violations, 69 million barrels of frozen Iranian oil, $6 billion of accumulated financial damage, and a hypersonic missile that travels at Mach 5, maneuvers unpredictably on its terminal approach, and can reach any target in Iran in less time than it takes the regime to issue a press release denying it has a nuclear weapons program. The Dark Eagle is not just a weapon system. It is a message delivered not in diplomatic cables or public statements, but in the cold, precise language of strategic military capability, a language that has meaning regardless of whether the regime in Tehran chooses to hear it. So here is where we land, and here is what should occupy every serious analyst watching this confrontation. If the Dark Eagle is approved for deployment, and if the conflict resumes, it will mark the beginning of a new chapter in the history of warfare. The first combat use of American hypersonic strike capability against one of the most hardened military target networks in the Middle East, in a confrontation that the entire world is watching. The precedent set by that first use will echo through every subsequent decade of strategic competition between the United States and its peer adversaries. And if the mere threat of its deployment is enough to shift Iranian calculations toward genuine diplomatic engagement, then the Dark Eagle will have accomplished its most important mission without ever leaving its launcher. But the question that nobody can answer with confidence right now is which scenario we are actually heading toward. Is Tehran genuinely absorbing the strategic message being sent, recalibrating internally in ways that public defiance rhetoric is designed to obscure? Or are the hardliners in the IRGC so institutionally committed to resistance that they will absorb economic devastation and hypersonic strikes rather than make the accommodations that the current situation demands? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if the first Dark Eagle is fired, and if it performs exactly as designed against Iran's hardened military infrastructure, what happens in the command bunkers of Beijing and Moscow in the hours that follow? Does the demonstrated reality of American hypersonic strike capability in combat conditions stabilize the broader strategic competition, or does it accelerate it in directions that no one has fully modeled? The Dark Eagle is being readied. The targets are mapped. The decision is on the table, and the next move belongs to Iran.